it's really what the two people said in the introduction here. Registers of beneficial ownership are a tool. They're not the sort of, I think they are the most important tool, but they are a tool in the fight not just against corruption, but against just the flow of all illicit finance. So whether it's tax evasion, tax avoidance, money laundering, there's a whole sort of spectrum. And what we need, the reason we want the register is we need to know who owns what where. It's as simple as that. Who owns what where. And the second thing is they have to be public. So there is a growing acceptance internationally now, led by some of the international organizations, that countries ought to have their national registers of beneficial ownership. And here in Argentina, you have it on a state basis. But there's a growing acceptance that it's got to be public. And let me just tell you why from the British experience. We do have a public register of beneficial ownership. It's not good, and I'll come back. It's not perfect, so I'll come back to why not. But before it was public, there were about 70 inquiries from various jurisdictions into that register to find out, to try and trace the flow of illicit finance. Since we've made it public, there's been over 2 million people who have accessed the register. This isn't an anti-business agenda. It's never it's all about fairness. The quality of that register is hugely important. So the nature of the information that is collected, we're still not there. This is where we in Britain have more work to do. You have to have information that gives you the unique identification of who is the owner, and there are ways you can do that. And then you've got to make sure that actually there are sufficient resources that check, validate the information. And in the UK, one of my arguments for the government is they have 6 people who are responsible for maintaining our register in Companies House. So it's full of inaccuracies. It isn't as complete. It's better than, we've got it and it's public, but it needs to be improved. We know from the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers how much illicit finance goes through that. Half of the entities, this is a shocking fact, half of the entities that were uncovered in the Panama Papers were entities that were registered in a British overseas territory, the British Virgin Islands, half. So we play an important role in the world's flow of illicit finance. You need a tough regulatory framework if you're going to bear down on the flow of illicit finance, whether it's through tax evasion, tax avoidance, anything, money laundering. And we have a pretty deregulated regime in the UK that has been developed by successive governments. That doesn't work. And then you need tough enforcement agencies, which have to be properly resourced. So give them the tool of a public register, but that register has to be accurate, it has to be verified, it has to sit in a good regulatory framework, and you have to have strong enforcement agencies, properly staffed, to really bear down. And just to say, I know you talk a lot here about corruption, and we have we don't have the same sort of corruption as you have here, but don't focus just on corruption. So it's not, corruption is important, it's the flow of money actually into our country, which is also important, the flow of illicit finance, how we facilitate it, particularly with our tax havens, and its tax evasion and avoidance. This is a big agenda, and if we could solve that, if we would actually do that, you could actually, what you could do in terms of the quality of public services and creating a more equal society in the very unequal world in which we live is just tremendous, without necessarily raising taxes hugely. It doesn't have to be through, it's just by getting in what you are missing out on. And one of the things I'm quite proud of is that we moved from tax only being discussed by tax professionals, the very rich and the big corporate multi-corporations, to it being an issue of conversation between in England in the pub or over the dinner table. And that's really important. When the Panama Papers were published, and I found this horrific fact that the British Virgin Isles was responsible for half the entities that were cited in the Panama Papers, I realized that our jurisdictions, our overseas territories and our crown dependencies were absolutely central to the illicit flow of money. And the other thing I began to understand was Britain, which had a reputation for being a trusted place in which to do business because of our legal framework and structure and other, our tradition, actually was very quickly becoming the jurisdiction of choice for kleptocrats, money laundering, illicit finance of all sorts. And one of the reasons for that was our association with our secret tax havens, our secret jurisdictions. So I realized we would have to tackle that. And we went to visit them and told them we'd win if we got a legislative opportunity. We found a legislative opportunity. The government then withdrew the legislation before we had a chance to put it to vote. But the three jurisdictions realized the game's up, so they have voluntarily conceded that they too will implement. So we're going to get public registers now in Britain and in all our tax havens. Not until 2023, so we have to work really hard, which is much longer than we wanted. And Europe, just to say this, Europe, which arrived a bit later, Britain took the lead. Europe then did start acting, and I think Europe is now leading on many of these transparency issues. So Europe has brought in a directive which has to be implemented by the end of 2020, whereby all the nations in the European Union will have public registers of beneficial ownership. And we now want to encourage every other jurisdiction to do that. Until we get it globally, we will not really be able to follow the money. I mean, at the moment, there are literally 6 or 10 people in Companies House checking the data, so they can't do it. They can't do it. So you've got to resource that properly. So, people put down a phony name, they won't, as long as the name's in the box, they won't actually check the name. And then I think this thing about a unique identifier that the NGO sector is fighting for very hard is really important, so that the quality of the data makes sure that you really get to the beneficial owner. Rich people, big corporations, don't dream up these schemes on their own. They are invented and marketed by the advisors. And whether it's the big 4 accountancy firms or the big banks, including HSBC, or the lawyers, they are never held to account. So one of the other areas that we want to work hard is to actually make them accountable in law for the advice they give. And if we, I think, could crack that, again, that would limit the way in which these advisors facilitate the flow of illicit finance.